Week number 8 and final review of Sustanon 250. It has been a fun one, my dudes, and I know you guys have been seriously waiting for this moment. Blood work, as well as measurements. And to me, guys, honestly, the testosterone levels when we were done with this cycle actually surprised me. I'm also going to be covering the pros and the cons from what I experienced on Sus 250, as well as my before and after pictures weeks 1 compared to week 8. And you know, guys, I'm going to give you my final recommendation, a brutally honest one with a final rating. If you haven't seen weeks 1 through 7 yet, go check those out first. Come back to this one, Sustanon 250 pros list. Let's get it. I've been consistent with this benefit. I pretty much covered it every single week. The vascularities and the pumps have been strong throughout the entire time. My libido has been high pretty much throughout the whole time. I think weeks 5, it kind of diminished a little bit, but it came back. Aggression was strong throughout. Grip strength, that was also strong up until about week 6 or so, but I think that's when COVID set in, week 7-ish, which obviously is another variable that we need to think about when looking at our measurements and our blood markers, but I accounted for that. I controlled for that variable. No reason to worry about it. And the measurements actually did kind of surprise me a little bit. But just a reminder, we started out bulking at 3,500 calories, and then we switched to cutting. We dropped it down to 2,900, so we brought it down about 600 calories. So this was more or less a recomp cycle. Overall cons. An important one is when I was taking 2 of these bad boys, I noticed that I was feeling very hypoglycemic. So when I switched it to 1, I was good to go. However, the tiredness, this is something that I pretty much had a low-grade tiredness throughout, and I really couldn't shake it. I had some days better than others when I got a little bit more sleep, but that's something that was just low-grade throughout the entire time, as well as anxiety. And this one for me, if you don't struggle with anxiety, you probably don't have to worry about this, but I'm an American living a busy life, trying to do all the things. So anxiety is something that I've always struggled with. This, I did notice, increased it a little bit. And I did have some breathing issues in week 5, but that went away. I think my body was just trying to adjust, trying to figure out what the heck was going on, because weeks 6, 7, 8, I didn't have any of them. Now, I also had insomnia, which insomnia I'm characterizing as just a latency in being able to fall asleep. So basically like an hour to 2 hours longer it took me to fall asleep. And I noticed this because right when I stopped, I had my sleep back and I can now get my full 8 hours in. And dehydration. I think anyone who takes a pro hormone doesn't even have to be Sustanon 250. It could be any of them. This is a factor. It dried me out, and still I'm off of it now for a week and a half, and I'm still feeling dried out. I feel like I could never get enough water. And here's a look at my final before and afters, weeks 1 compared to week 8. So this is actually 2 weeks off of cycle, and you can already see that my body composition is changing a little bit. You can see that I'm a little more puffy in the midsection, but this is just part of coming off. So in total, I went from 223 pounds in week 1 to 228 pounds in week 8. So a 5-pound gain total. And to see where I actually gained this, let's go ahead and take a look at my measurements. And keep in mind that I did take 5 sets of measurements over a 5-day period, just so we can control for as much water weight as possible. Forearms, 14 inches week 1, 14 inches in week 8. So no change there. Biceps, 16 inches in week 1 and 16.5 inches week 8. Not much, but remember, we are on a cut here. Quads went from 25 inches week 1 to 25.25 week 8. Again, not much, but still something. Waist went from 35.5 inches in week 1 to 34 inches in week 8. So a total of 1.5 inches lost. And without further ado, the showcased body part, my back, which was my main focus here on my Sus 250 cycle. 20 inches week 1 to 22 inches in week 8. So 2 total inches added to the width of my back, which is pretty crazy considering I was on a cut. I'm thinking Sustanon 250 did have something to do with this. Before I reveal the before and after blood work, I do need to mention that there are some limiting factors here. Now, we try to control for them as much as possible, but the variables still do exist. So we need to think about this when we're looking at the numbers. Number 1 being that I think the most effective dose is going to be 2 pills a day, but I couldn't control for the anxiety. It was too much. So I had to personally go down to 1. Maybe you're not like that and you can do 2. The other thing is that in week 7, I got COVID. Now, I didn't see any direct impact on the markers, but it's something that we still need to consider. And the last thing is that I am on TRT. I was, am, and will continue to be. And what that means when we look at our markers is that LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, are going to be much lower when compared to someone who's not, if not pretty much all the way at the bottom of the reference range. But we can still look at the comparison to make an assessment. So here we go with the blood markers. Estrogen or estradiol 2. The reference range is 30 pg per milliliter to 44 pg per milliliter. Week 1, I was at 35 pg per milliliter to week 8, 52 pg per milliliter, indicating that Sus 250 did in fact aromatize the estrogen as expected. It's a 4-andro. So now let's look at the liver enzymes. Let's look at ALT first. So the ALT reference range is 4 to 36 units per liter. I went from 22 units in week 1 to 37 units in week 8, right outside the reference range. But keep in mind here that if you were to exercise 1 to 2 days prior to a blood test, this can falsely elevate your liver enzymes, especially if you worked out really hard, because ALT and AST are basically measuring the inflammation of your liver. But it's not just your liver, it's your entire body. And so if you worked out really hard, you'll have a lot of extra inflammation that you wouldn't otherwise have, and this can falsely elevate your ALT and AST. Now let's look at AST. And the reference range here is 8 to 33 units per liter. I went from 9 in week 1 to 13 units in week 8. So well within the reference range. I also just genetically run a lower AST. And now looking at my kidney levels. So creatinine. The reference range for healthy males is 65.4 to 119.3 microsomes per liter. Mine's typically on the high end, just right above that normal reference range, just because I've worked out for so many years and I eat a lot. You might notice something similar. But looks like SUS250 really didn't have much of an effect here. It went from 110 in week 1 to 111 microsomes per liter in week 8. Now let's look to see if there's any indication of shutdown or not with SUS250 by looking at my FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. So the healthy FSH reference range is 1 to 9 units. I started at week 1 at 1, and I went down to 0.7 by week 8. And I know some of you are going to say, well, he's on TRT, he can't make that assessment. But keep in mind, we're looking before and after. Did I start at the low end of the reference range? Yes, but hey, at least I made the reference range. Most people on TRT are completely shut down and have 0 or like 0.1, 0.2. But nevertheless, we can see that it went down 0.3, which indicates there is some shutdown. Now let's look at LH, or luteinizing hormone. I started at 1 in week 1 and went down to 0.6 by week 8, which again indicates not a lot, but there is some shutdown. And finally, the moment of truth. Drum roll, please. Testosterone levels. What are they? Does it work? But first, if you want to see more reviews like this, and want to come join us for the ride, hit that subscribe button, smash that bell button. We would love to have you. And by the way, let me know if you want me to run something specifically. My next cycle, 8 weeks from now, toss in the comments below. I might end up doing it. Now let's finally take a look at my testosterone levels. The testosterone reference range is absurdly large, 300 to 1200 nanograms per deciliter. I went from 800 in week 1 to 910 nanograms per deciliter in week 8. As for my free testosterone, which has a reference range from 2.29 to 21.2 nanograms per deciliter, I went from 21.2 in week 1 to 39.9 nanograms per deciliter in week 8. So these numbers overall do indicate some pretty beneficial things. 110 nanograms per deciliter, weeks 1 to week 8. Estrogen went up, so we know that some aromatization did take place, which makes sense because SUS250 is a 4-andro. And we saw LH and FSH go down, even though I'm on TRT, we're controlling for that, even comparing down 0.3, that indicates that there is slight suppression. Overall, guys, though, the limiting factors I had, having COVID, switching from 2 to 1 pill a day, these things I don't think really got in the way with the blood work from what I could tell. But all in all, the SUS250, does it do what it says it does? Does it do what it's intended to do? Does it do what the marketing says it does? In my opinion, yes. Would I personally take it again? Probably not. Only because of that anxiety. It's low grade. It's not crazy high, but it's always just there. And the tiredness, yeah, it's kind of part of taking pro hormones, but for me specifically, SUS250 and 4-andros in general make me a little bit more tired. So I personally like to run 1 testosterone or a 1-andro instead because I don't have as much anxiety and I'm not near as tired. But we're here to talk about SUS250 and what my final rating is. And that is going to be a 6 out of 10 for me. Now, if you want to pick up SUS250 or any other pro hormone, I've partnered up with some companies and I've gotten you some 10% discount codes. So if you want to use those, I've thrown them in the description for you. And over the next 7 days, in between our pro hormone cycles, we're going to use Melanotin 2. Before we go on our Costa Rica trip, my wife and I are using it. You might already be able to tell I'm a little bit more tan, and you might even be able to see some extra moles. Tan and horny, they call it. I'll report back. Until then, stay safe and stay swole, my brothers.